October 14th, 1943, 27,000 feet over Schweinfurt, Germany. Staff Sergeant Michael Archangelo pressed his frost-bitten cheek against the frozen curve of the ball turret's plexiglass. From his cramped position beneath the belly of the B-17, he saw something coming that shouldn't have been possible. A Focke-Wulf 190, fast, close, and diving straight at them, closing at over 400 miles per hour. Archangelo's training screamed at him to wait. Wait until the silhouette filled the ring's sight. Wait for the perfect shot. That's what 6 months of gunnery school had drilled into him, again and again. Hold your fire until the range is right. Don't waste ammo. But Archangelo didn't wait. They followed the manual. And they died. By the summer of 1943, the gunners knew it. They weren't delusional. They weren't naive. They were cynical, hardened in the worst possible way by statistics. They joked darkly among themselves, calling each other clay pigeons, because that's what they felt like. Targets thrown into the sky to be shot at for someone else's theory of air warfare. They knew the odds. They knew that when a FW-190 appeared dead ahead, leveling out for a head-on run, they had maybe 3 seconds to live. 3 seconds to spot the incoming fighter. 3 seconds to identify the silhouette, calculate the angle, swing the guns, lead the target, and fire. 3 seconds to pray the German didn't shoot first. But he always did. American gunners were trained to fire at 400 yards. German pilots fired at 600. The Germans always fired first. That wasn't pessimism, that was math. And that math was why men like Michael Archangelo had watched their friends die in the ball turret, in the waste guns, sprawled across the radio room floor, slumped over the Norden bomb site, burned into the aluminum ribs of the fuselage. Then it got worse. By September 1943, the Luftwaffe introduced a new tactic, one so brutally effective that American intelligence officers questioned the initial reports. Sturmgruppen, storm groups, FW-190s modified into flying battering rams, extra armor plates welded across the cockpit and engine cowling, thick glass replacing the canopy, for 20mm cannons, heavy machine guns, extra ammunition drums, reinforced wings. These aircraft weren't built to maneuver. They were built to smash through bomber formations. And the pilots who flew them had orders so direct, so lethal, that even German officers described them as suicidal. Close to 200 yards before firing. Get close enough to see the American gunner's face. Then pull the trigger. No weaving. No evasive turns. No aerobatics. No hesitation. Just a straight-in, full-throttle charge, an armored monster coming head-on, closing at a combined 500 miles per hour. A 2-second burst from 4 cannons at that range could saw a B-17 in half. And it often did. The tactic worked because it weaponized human psychology. When a fighter rushes straight at you, growing from a tiny speck to a full-sized predator in seconds, your instincts scream the same thing every time. Shoot now. Right now? Pull the trigger before he does. But if a gunner fired too early, his rounds drifted harmlessly into the empty sky. If he fired too late, he died. The sweet spot, the range where an accurate burst might actually hit, was about 400 yards, 4 football fields. But at 500 miles per hour, that distance vanished in under 2 seconds. The Luftwaffe pilots knew this. They relied on it. They exploited it. While American gunners hesitated, waiting for the perfect shot, German pilots were already squeezing their triggers at 600 yards. The Germans always fired first. And the results? Catastrophic. On October 14th, 1943, the U.S. 8th Air Force launched 291 B-17s toward Schweinfurt, deep inside Germany, beyond escort range. They knew it would be bloody, but no one expected what came next. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had at the formation. 40 minutes of combat. Wave after wave of head-on attacks. Sturmgruppe FW-190s charging like armored bulls. Me-109s diving from the sun. Cannon shells ripping wings off in single bursts. By the time the survivors limped back across the channel, 60 B-17s were missing. 17 more were so mangled they were written off. Over 650 men were killed, wounded, or captured. The mission was later given a simple, brutal name: Black Thursday. And after Black Thursday, the panic in the 8th Air Force headquarters was palpable. General officers, intelligence analysts, training commanders, They all gathered in emergency sessions. They replayed gun camera footage frame by frame. They dissected debriefings. They interviewed every gunner who survived a head-on attack. The question was no longer academic. Why are so many gunners dying? Why are they missing at ranges where the enemy is hitting? And how do we stop it before the bombing campaign collapses entirely? They didn't know it yet, but the answer was going to come from men like Michael Archangelo. Men who ignored the manual, broke the rules, and fired first. The pattern couldn't be ignored anymore. The gunners who fired early, who opened up at 800 or even 1,000 yards, survived more often than the ones who followed the manual and waited for the clean shot. But that didn't make any sense. At 1,000 yards, a FW190 was no bigger than a pencil eraser held at arm's length. A shimmering speck framed in freezing plexiglass. The bullet drop at that range was over 50 feet. If the German pilot was turning even slightly, the necessary deflection angle to lead the target was a geometric nightmare. Every gunner knew it. Every instructor had drilled it into them. Don't waste rounds. Wait for the fill. Don't shoot at ghosts. At that distance, 50 caliber rounds spread in a wide cone. At 1,000 yards, that cone was over 30 feet wide. The chances of actually hitting anything were mathematically negligible. So why were the early shooters still alive? The official answer came down to two words: suppressive fire. That was the new theory being floated by operations officers and analysts back in England. Tracers streaking through the air, even wildly inaccurate ones, had a psychological effect. They made incoming fighters flinch, made them hesitate, made them question their angle of attack or their timing, maybe even made them break off entirely. You weren't trying to kill the enemy. You were trying to make him nervous. It sounded elegant. It sounded scientific. But men like Michael Archangelo weren't satisfied with elegant theories. Archangelo was the ball turret gunner aboard the B-17 Hell's Angel, flying with the 303rd Bomb Group out of Molesworth. He was 22 years old, a kid by civilian standards, a veteran by bomber command math. He'd grown up in Philadelphia, working in his father's machine shop since he was tall enough to reach a workbench. Lathes, drill presses, calibration gauges. He grew up around precision. He understood mechanical systems in a way few gunners did. He understood things that training manuals didn't teach, things like harmonics, tolerances, rotational physics. He understood that a machine gun wasn't just a weapon, it was a tool for changing the equation. And what Archangelo understood more than anything was this: sometimes it wasn't about hitting. It was about being seen. On October 14th, during that slaughter over Schweinfurt, he'd pulled the triggers at 1,200 yards, a range so ridiculous that his instructors would have laughed. But he'd seen it with his own eyes. The FW190 had twitched. Not a hard break, not a panic dive, just the smallest deviation, a quarter second of hesitation. But that hesitation was everything. It meant the 20mm shells missed the ball turret by 15 feet. It meant Archangelo survived. And that single twitch rewrote the laws of aerial gunnery for him. After the mission, while crews were peeling frozen blood from the catwalks and counting bullet holes in the fuselage, Archangelo started talking. Not to the officers, not to the mission debriefers. He talked to other gunners, the ones sleeping in the same drafty barracks, nursing the same whiskey, staring at the same lists of dead men posted outside the mess. Most of them thought he was crazy. Firing at 1,000 yards? Wasting ammo? Breaking doctrine? That kind of stunt got you chewed out by the crew chief and grounded by the squadron CO. But a few, the quiet ones who'd survived more than 10 missions, leaned in and listened. Because they'd seen it too. Fighters hesitating when the tracers started flying. FW190S and Me-109S pulling up early, aborting clean runs when the incoming fire started earlier than expected. One of them, a wiry ball turret operator from Kansas named Benny Goodman, put it best. "They're not Superman," he said. "They don't want to die either. If they see tracers, they think twice." The problem? Doctrine forbade it. The manuals were still clear. Don't fire until you can fill the sight. Conserve ammo. Keep your powder dry. The brass in England didn't want gunners firing blind. The logistics officers hated the increased ammo consumption. The gunnery instructors hated the idea of uncalculated fire. But combat didn't care. The breakthrough came quietly, not in some policy change or command memo, but in the freezing skies over the North Sea, On a November morning in 1943, Archangelo's B-17 had just dropped its payload on Bremen. The formation was scattered. German fighters had hammered them over the target, splitting the box apart. 3 bombers were already missing. No shoot seen. The Hell's Angel was flying in loose trail, limping slightly, its starboard engine leaking oil, its tail gunner out cold from shrapnel. Then Archangelo saw it. Another FW-190, rolling in from high noon, dead ahead, beginning its dive. The sun glinted off its cowling. Its wings were loaded, cannons ready. The classic head-on run. Archangelo didn't wait. Didn't ask permission. Didn't think. He just pulled the triggers. 1,100 yards. Tracer fire lit the sky like an angry comet. Wildly inaccurate, spread out over the empty air. The fighter kept coming. 900 yards. Still diving. Still committed. Archangelo didn't flinch. He just kept firing. At 700 yards, the German broke. Not much. Just enough. A hard wobble. A shift in dive angle. The FW-190 sheared off to starboard. His cannon fire ripping under the belly of the bomber, missing. And then, for the first time in months, the intercom crackled with something new. "Ball turret," the waist gunner said. "You made him flinch." The survivors were limping home. 2 engines, sometimes 3. Whatever still worked. Flak holes in the wings, hydraulic fluid pooling on the floor. Some bombers flew with half their glass blown out, canvas flapping in the slipstream like torn skin. Men bled into flak jackets. Others sat slumped in silence, eyes wide, too shell-shocked to speak. The Luftwaffe wasn't done. FW-190s followed them like wolves, pacing from a distance, waiting to pick off the stragglers, waiting for one more clean shot, one more easy kill. Michael Archangelo was still in his ball turret. His turret stank of cordite and sweat, the steel hot from friction, the plexiglass fogging with frost. His hands were numb, barely able to feel the twin. 50s under his gloves. He had maybe 50 rounds left in each barrel. A few seconds of fire, if that. And he saw it. One lone FW-190, low and steady, about 2,000 yards back, just a speck pacing them, tracking them. The German wasn't attacking. He was waiting, calculating angles, watching the bomber's crippled speed, planning the moment he'd roll in and finish them. Archangelo didn't wait. He opened fire. 2,000 yards, more than a mile. A thumbnail-sized speck in the sky. He knew he wouldn't hit it. That wasn't the point. He walked the tracers across empty air, sweeping them left and right, up and down. Not at the fighter, but at the space it needed to attack. He built a curtain of fire, a wall of glowing red lines between their bomber and the hunter behind it. And it worked. The FW-190 twitched, then banked left, climbing to reposition. Trying a different angle. Archangelo spun his turret. The fighter came again, from the 3 o'clock high. He fired another burst. Early. Wide. Wild. The German broke off again. For times it happened. Each approach came from a different angle. Each time, Archangelo fired before the attack even started. Each time, the fighter saw the tracers and backed off. After the 4th attempt, the FW-190 leveled out, waggled its wings, and turned back toward Germany. Archangelo watched it fade into the clouds. The last predator deciding that this prey wasn't worth the risk. He'd fired around 200 rounds. Hadn't hit a thing. But he'd survived. And he'd figured something out. The manual said, wait for the enemy to commit. Wait until he's in range. Fire accurately. Kill him. But that doctrine assumed the goal was to shoot down the fighter. Archangelo understood something different. The goal wasn't to kill the enemy. The goal was to survive. And survival didn't require a kill. It required doubt. If the enemy hesitated, even for a moment, if he second-guessed his angle, if he misjudged your range, if he thought twice, then you lived. And that was enough. When Hell's Angel finally limped back to Molesworth, wheels hitting the runway with a bone-rattling jolt, Archangelo didn't go to the mess or the briefing room. He went straight to the gun shop. He found the armorer, Sergeant Diageo, a squat man with grease-stained fingers and a permanent scowl, who'd been maintaining Browning. 50 calories since before Pearl Harbor. Archangelo didn't rant. He didn't beg. He just explained what he'd seen, what he'd done, what had worked. Diageo listened. He didn't roll his eyes. Didn't call him a crackpot. Because he'd been hearing similar stories. Gunners from other squadrons. Men who had started firing early. Men who wasted ammo. Men who broke Doctrine. Men who came home. Diageo knew weapons. He understood that a 50 calories round at 1,000 yards still carried lethal force. It might not punch through engine blocks. It might not rip a fighter in half, but it could hull a wing, crack a canopy, chip a prop blade, or just rattle the pilot enough to make him rethink his next move. And even if the rounds missed completely, even if not a single bullet connected, they still told the enemy something important. This gunner is awake. This gunner is ready. This is not a free kill. This gunner is aggressive. This gunner will shoot before I'm ready. And that, not the bullets, not the hits, not even the damage. That idea changed everything. It changed the psychology of the attack. A Luftwaffe pilot coming in on AB-17 was running math in his head. Speed, distance, closure rate, deflection angle. He had maybe 5 seconds to line up the shot, 5 seconds to lock in, push forward on the throttle, commit to the run. And once he committed, once his nose pointed at the bomber, he was committed. No weaving, no dodging, no backing out. He had to hold the line, eyes fixed on the target, hands steady, waiting for 400 yards, then 300, then 200. And those 5 seconds, those were the most dangerous seconds of his life. Because that's when he couldn't move. That's when he was the target. So what happened when tracers started flying at him before he was ready? Before he was locked in? He had a choice. He could grit his teeth and trust his armor, push through the storm of glowing lines. Or he could abort, climb, circle around, try again from a different angle. Most pilots chose to abort, not because they were cowards, not because they panicked, but because in that split second, they did the math. Aborting cost them nothing. They could try again in 30 seconds. Another angle, another run, a better opportunity. But pushing through early tracers? That cost something. Maybe a hit in the radiator. Maybe a fuel line rupture. Maybe a cockpit full of fire. And so they pulled off. Again, and again, and again. It worked. And it worked because of physics. Because what Archangelo had discovered wasn't just tactical, it was mechanical. It was a lesson in ballistics, dispersion, and fear, none of which were explained in gunnery school. They never taught him this. First, bullet trajectory at altitude. A 50 caliber round left the barrel at nearly 2,900 feet per second. At sea level, that bullet might travel 7,000 yards before falling inert. But at 27,000 feet, in the thin stratospheric air above Germany, the rules changed. Less drag, less drop, flatter arc, longer range. At 1,200 yards, a 50 caliber round still carried over 1,800 foot-pounds of energy. Enough to shatter a canopy, fracture a wing spar, or crack an engine block. The training manuals treated 600 yards as max effective range. That was Doctrine. Archangelo had just doubled it. Second, the cone of fire. Machine guns didn't shoot lasers. They weren't precise instruments. They were brutal, mechanical blunt tools. And they didn't fire in a line. They fired in a cone, a widening spread of bullets that scattered more the farther they flew. At 400 yards, that cone was 10 feet wide. At 1,000 yards, it was 30 feet. At 1,500? 50. That cone was supposed to be a problem. Instructors called it dispersion, a flaw, a limitation. But Archangelo saw it differently. It was a net. You didn't have to hit the pilot. You just had to hit something. A wing, a tail, a fuel line. And even if you didn't hit, if your rounds only came close, the tracers would do the rest. Third, the human factor. A Luftwaffe pilot in an FW-190 couldn't see individual bullets slicing through the air. He couldn't hear the gunfire or feel the wind of near misses. But he could see the tracers. Every fifth round in a 50 calories belt was a tracer. A bullet tipped with a pyrotechnic compound that burned bright orange as it flew. At 1,000 yards, a stream of 50 calories tracers looked like a stream of fire aimed directly at your face. Bright, angry, violent. A pilot rolling in at 500 miles per hour, eyes locked on his gun sight, suddenly saw those streaks. Saw them early, saw them before he was ready. And he had to make a decision. Was this gunner just panicking? Or was this gunner dialed in, locked on, and ready to kill? Even if he didn't know the answer. Even if the burst was wide and wild. The doubt was enough. The hesitation. The twitch in the stick. The missed shot that followed. Diageo watched the film twice. Then he smiled. A slow, knowing smile that didn't need words. He'd seen what Archangelo had seen. Two FW-190s. Fast, aggressive, head-on. Break away before firing. No smoke. No flashes from their cannons. No last-second trade of fire. Just two veteran German pilots turning off, peeling away, because of tracers. Not hits. Not damage. Just fear. Archangelo had turned his own bomber into a reference grid. A gun sight made of wings. He didn't aim at the enemy. He aimed through the air they were about to occupy. And through his own plane, if he had to. The instructors back at Wendover Field would have called it suicide. Firing through your own wings. Insane. Dangerous. Reckless. But in combat, with 20mm shells chewing through aluminum and friends burning alive in turrets. Doctrinal purity didn't matter. Survival did. That night, in the barracks, Archangelo laid it all out for the others. The new theory. The geometry. The range. The angles. How to use the bomber's wings as aiming references. Where to fire. When to fire. Why to fire before the enemy ever committed. Some of the younger gunners stared at him like he was crazy. Some just shrugged and walked out. But the veterans. The men with 20 missions under their belts and 1,000-yard stares in their eyes. They listened. Benny Goodman from the 379th. Cal Roberts, who'd had to hose blood out of his turret after Schweinfurt. Even Big Jake Taylor, the top waist gunner in the 91st Bomb Group, who rarely spoke to anyone. They leaned in. Because they'd seen it too. The twitch. That half-second of doubt in the Germans' dive. That invisible hesitation before the cannons opened up. And now, for the first time, someone had put words to it. Math to it. Tactics to it. It started to spread. Not officially. Not in briefings. Not in printed manuals. But in barracks whispers. In coffee lines and bomb load meetings. In cramped mess halls over cold beans and lukewarm coffee. Aim over your own wing. Fire at 1,200 yards. Make him blink before they commit. Archangelo's theory didn't have a name, but gunners knew it when they saw it. They called it the early burst, or burning daylight, or just doing it Mike's way. Whatever the name, it worked. And in the skies over Germany, something began to change. Diageo understood. You're not shooting at the fighter, he said, voice low, as if explaining an old truth rediscovered. You're shooting at the airspace. You're denying them the approach corridor. Exactly. It wasn't about marksmanship. It was area denial, but with precision. Calculated chaos. Tracers weren't just bullets. They were boundaries. Warnings. Lines in the sky that said, not here. Not today. And it worked. But for it to work, it required something else. Something harder than geometry. Belief. You had to believe it before you saw it work. The first time you pulled the triggers at 1,200 yards, your whole brain would scream. Too early. Too far. You're going to get court-martialed. You had to ignore that voice. Trust the physics. Trust the math. Trust that a 50 caliber round at altitude still hit like a sledgehammer if it found a target. And trust that the enemy pilot, seeing those glowing streaks in the sky, would trust his instincts too and flinch. It started with Archangelo. But like all good ideas in a war zone, it spread like a rumor. First Benny Goodman and Tony Rizzo, both ball turret gunners. Then Earl Patterson, a quiet kid from Kansas who rarely spoke but never missed a post-mission debrief. They didn't teach it in mission briefings. They whispered it in the barracks after lights out. No officers. No manuals. Just coffee, cigarettes, and raw nerves. Try aiming above the wing. Start shooting early, real early. Watch their nose twitch when the tracers come close. They compared stories, refined the technique like gunsmiths tuning a trigger. And by January 1944, the Hells Angels of the 303rd Bomb Group had a dozen gunners doing it deliberately. The first real field test came from Jack Murphy. Waist gunner, 20 years old. Red hair, freckles, hands like baseball gloves. Grew up outside Sioux City, Iowa. Shot pheasants before he could spell the word. He didn't know anything about fire cones or deflection math, but he understood what it meant when a bird spooked at the glint of sun off a shotgun barrel. The power of suggestion. January 11th, 1944. Over Ostersleben. Murphy's B-17 fell behind after a flak burst knocked out an engine. They were alone, and a Bf-109 found them, hovering at 1,800 yards, just pacing, waiting. Murphy didn't wait. He opened up with both. 50s at a speck in the sky. 1,800 yards. Insane. He aimed high. Real high. Above the fighter, above the horizon. His tracers carved a lazy arc through the air, glowing orange against the cloud bank. The 109 twitched, broke right, circled back. Murphy tracked it, fired again. Another glowing curve. Another hesitation. It happened 6 times. 6 separate approach attempts. Murphy used 400 rounds. He didn't hit a damn thing. But the fighter never closed within 1,200 yards. Never fired a shot. Eventually, low on fuel or frustrated, the German peeled off and disappeared into the haze. Back on the ground at Molesworth, Murphy's pilot, Lieutenant Kowalski, found him. What the hell was that? Murphy told him. Kowalski didn't understand the physics, but he understood survival. Understood that his wings were still attached and none of his boys were bleeding. He told the other pilots. By February 1944, the technique was moving. Not through headquarters. Not through tactical air command, but through the real channels. Crew chiefs, armorers, gunners, radio men. The lifers and lifeblood of the 8th Air Force. They passed it like a secret handshake. Start early. Aim high. Make him think twice. The 379th heard it next. Then the 91st. Then the 384th. In mess halls, over burnt coffee. On tarmacs while loading belts of ammo. In debrief rooms where gunners lit cigarettes with shaking hands and muttered, "Worked again today." The Doctrine didn't approve. But the Luftwaffe started noticing something strange. American bombers were shooting earlier, more often, and with frightening coordination. He opened fire at 1,200 yards, 4 times the effective range of his twin. 50 caliber Brownings. Tracers arced uselessly into blue sky. His guns thundered, brass casings clinking against the walls of the turret, vibrating through his arms and chest. The Focke-Wulf kept coming, unfazed. At 800 yards, the German fighter's nose lit up, 20 millimeters cannon fire, streaking directly toward the vulnerable underbelly of the fortress. Archangelo didn't flinch. He held the triggers down. His barrels glowed red-hot in the thin, oxygen-starved air. Then, a twitch. A hesitation. The Focke-Wulf wavered, just slightly, in its dive. The pilot had seen the tracers. They weren't close enough to hit, but they were close enough to be seen. Close enough to get in his head. Close enough to force a second thought. That half-second hesitation saved Archangelo's life. The cannon shells that should have ripped through his turret passed 15 feet wide. Instead, they punched through the B-17's right wing, tearing through aluminum, fuel tanks, and hydraulic lines. A fireball erupted. The bomber rocked violently. But Archangelo was still alive. Still firing. The Focke-Wulf blew past at 500 miles per hour, gone in an instant. Archangelo whipped his turret around, tracking it as the fighter pulled into a climbing turn. His tracers followed, stitching up into the sky like a jagged line drawn by instinct. On the intercom, the pilot barked. "Ball turret, what the hell are you shooting at?" That fighter was out of range. Archangelo didn't answer. He was watching the Focke-Wulf. It was already 1,400 yards out, circling, lining up for another pass. But it was hesitating. The German pilot was thinking, recalculating, wondering if that gunner in the turret below had just gotten lucky, or if he actually knew something the Luftwaffe didn't. In that moment, Archangelo realized something. Something no manual had ever taught. Something that defied doctrine, logic, and gunnery school training. Something that shouldn't have worked. But it did. And by the time that mission ended, the bloodiest day in the history of the 8th Air Force, 60 B-17s would fall from the sky. Over 600 men would die. But across that doomed formation, in ball turrets just like his, a handful of gunners would start doing exactly what Archangelo had done. And for some of them, it would be the difference between death and survival. The gunners who tried it, who broke from everything they'd been taught, started racking up kills. Not 1 or 2. Dozens. They shot down twice as many German fighters as anyone else. Because what happened next wasn't in any manual. No training course had prepared them for it. The problem had started in 1942 when the first B-17s arrived in England. The Flying Fortress was supposed to be untouchable. 10, 50 caliber machine guns, self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plate, redundant systems. Boeing engineers had promised it could defend itself without a single escort fighter. That was the theory. They called it a fortress for a reason. But the Luftwaffe proved otherwise, in just 3 weeks. August 17, 1942. The first American bombing raid over Nazi-occupied Europe. 12 B-17s targeted the rail yards at Rouen, France. A small force, carefully selected. Test the waters. See what the fortress could do on its own. Then the German fighters came. Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Focke-Wulf 190s. Climbing fast. Diving hard. Coordinated attacks from above and ahead. They closed at over 500 miles per hour in head-on passes. The American gunners opened fire, exactly as trained. Wait until the target fills the sight. Aim center mass. Lead the target slightly. Squeeze the trigger, don't jerk it. Every man followed procedure. Every single man missed. The German fighters slashed through the bomber formation like wolves through sheep. Cannon shells tore open fuselages. Oxygen tanks exploded. Ball turrets spun uselessly as bombers went down in flames. One fortress dropped from the sky, then another. The survivors limped home, riddled with holes, hydraulic fluid spraying, gunner positions shredded, men dead at their stations. One tail gunner's body was still strapped in, his legs missing below the knee. The commanders pored over the gun camera footage. They listened to the surviving gunners. They traced bullet paths and plotted impact points. The conclusion was devastatingly simple. They were firing too late. By the time a German fighter looked big enough to shoot, it was already inside the danger zone. The closing speed was too fast. A Bf 109 on a head-on pass gave a ball turret gunner less than 1 second to engage before it flashed past or opened fire first. And in that second, most gunners hesitated, waiting for the textbook shot. Waiting for that clean, perfect profile they'd practiced at gunnery school on cardboard silhouettes and towed targets. But the Germans weren't silhouettes. They were veterans. They'd been flying since 1939, over France, Britain, Russia. They had fought Hurricanes and Spitfires, shot down Soviet I-16s, and melted through unescorted RAF bomber streams. They knew timing, geometry, psychology. They knew that American gunners, green, nervous, rule-following, would hesitate. They'd wait for the perfect shot. And by then, they were dead. In the fall of 1942, the numbers told the truth. The 8th Air Force was losing 4% of its bombers, per mission. For out of every 100 fortresses vanished over Europe, shredded by cannon fire, spun into flat spins, or exploded midair from fuel tank detonations. And the crews? They were told their tour was 25 missions. Do the math. Most of them would never see home again. Commanders tried everything. They tightened formations, layered the boxes, forced the bombers to fly staggered, overlapping fields of fire. They added more machine guns, nose mounts, chin turrets, twin mounts. They made gunners study angles like geometry students before a final exam. They even brought in clay pigeon instructors from Texas, skeet shooters, to teach deflection shooting. Lead your target like it's a duck flying past a pond. None of it changed the numbers. The kill-to-hit ratio stayed the same. For every 100 rounds fired, maybe one hit. Maybe. And the fortresses kept going down. And the replacements kept coming. Fresh crews from Nebraska, Kansas, Pennsylvania. 19, 20 years old. Barely out of training. Nervous hands gripping new flak vests. Stepping into ball turrets for the first time, the sky stretching out in all directions. They were following the manual. They were doing everything right. And they were dying anyway. Sam Feinstein didn't care about doctrine. He cared about results. A ball turret gunner with the 379th Bomb Group, Feinstein had flown 23 missions and somehow survived every one. That meant more than any training manual. That was credibility. Between sorties, he started teaching. Unofficial. Off the record. In the hard stands, leaning against cold aluminum fuselages, Feinstein would gather new crews in the shadow of the B-17S. He'd point at the wings, gesture with oil-stained gloves, and explain, "You shoot through your own wings. I know it sounds crazy, but that's where they want to fly. You light up the space before they get there. They see the tracers, they think twice." The new gunners didn't know what to make of it. It sounded backwards. Reckless. Everything they'd learned in gunnery school said wait for the shot. Wait for the silhouette. Wait for the fighter to fill the reticle. Feinstein just shook his head. You wait, you die. And he was still breathing, which counted for something. By March 1944, the technique was spreading. There still wasn't a name for it. Some called it shooting early. Others called it shooting high, or firing through the wings. But whatever they called it, It was working. No official memo. No field directive. Just a quiet revolution. Gunner to gunner. Mission to mission. A shadow network of sergeants sharing what worked in the skies over Germany. And the numbers told the story. In January, the 303rd lost 7 bombers. In February, 5. In March, just 3. The formations were bleeding less. The German fighters were getting cautious. The turning point came in April 1944 during Big Week. The massive, multi-day offensive against Germany's aircraft production. The 8th Air Force sent over 1,000 bombers deep into the Reich. The Luftwaffe threw everything it had. FW-190s, Bf-109s, Bf-110s, even a few Me-262 jets, faster than anything the Americans had ever seen. And the gunners? They were ready. Hundreds of them, across multiple bomb groups, now using the early fire method. Opening up at 1,500 yards. At 1,800 yards. Some even at 2,000 yards, blasting at specks in the sky. To an outside observer, it looked like madness. Tracers laced the sky in every direction, a storm of fire. From the ground, it looked like panic. But it wasn't. It was deliberate chaos. Every stream of tracers denied a corridor of air. Every early burst created doubt in the mind of an attacking pilot. The Luftwaffe tried to push through, but there were no gaps. Every bomber had at least one gunner firing early, sometimes 2, sometimes all. The Germans started calling it Die Führerwand, the wall of fire. And it worked. Before the early fire method, deep penetration missions lost up to 10% of their bombers. During Big Week, the loss rate dropped to 6%. It was still bloody, 226 bombers lost. But without the new tactic, that number would have been much worse. And the most remarkable part? It still wasn't official. No orders. No training materials. Just sergeants teaching sergeants, whispering truths between missions, passing survival like contraband. By mid-1944, the technique had spread everywhere. Every heavy bomber group in England had heard of it. Most had tried it. Some had adopted it completely. And the Luftwaffe was noticing. German fighter pilots began reporting something strange in their debriefs. The gunners were opening fire earlier, far earlier than before. Tracers were streaking through the sky at ranges where hits should have been impossible. They weren't being hit, but they were being targeted, and that made them think. At first, German intelligence dismissed it. Panic fire, they called it. Inexperienced crews wasting ammunition. They were wrong. It wasn't panic. It was a paradigm shift, and it was changing the air war. It didn't make sense, at first. To Luftwaffe intelligence, the early fire tactic looked like a gift. The Americans were wasting ammo, spraying the sky at invisible enemies. That meant they'd run dry sooner. That meant they'd be vulnerable. But then the numbers came in, and the math told a different story. In March 1944, German fighter pilots were trading 1 fighter for every 2 bombers. A costly, but acceptable exchange. By June, it was 1 for every 4. The Luftwaffe was bleeding, slowly but steadily. Something had changed. Major Heinz Bahr noticed first. 204 kills. A German ace. Veteran of the Eastern Front, Africa, the Channel Front. He'd flown against Spitfires, Yaks, and Thunderbolts. He was fearless, efficient, ruthless. And now, in June 1944, he was flying over Munich. June 15th. Bahr led a flight of FW-190s toward a formation of B-17s. Bright skies, high altitude. The American formation glittered in the sun, aluminum sharks swimming through ice-blue air. Bahr spotted a bomber straggling slightly from the main box. Easy prey. He lined up for a head-on attack, the classic approach. Nose down, throttle wide, cannon armed. At 1,400 yards, it began. Tracers. Dozens of them. Orange spears lancing through empty sky. Not at him, but at where he was going to be. At the airspace he needed. He narrowed his eyes. Psychological warfare. The Americans were trying to make him flinch. He didn't flinch. At 1,200 yards, something hit. A jolt through the control stick. A fist-sized hole in his left wing. Just 1 round, probably a lucky hit. But he felt the wing flex, the airframe drag. His speed dropped 40 kilometers an hour. It was enough. Bahr cursed and peeled away, climbing hard, smoke trailing from the hole in his wing. He made it home. But when he landed, he climbed out of the cockpit and walked straight to the wing. Touched the hole. felt the jagged aluminum edges with his gloves off, stared at it for a long time. Just one round, fired from over a kilometer away. It hadn't taken him out, but it had reached him. And now, no matter how experienced he was, no matter how confident, he'd remember that hit. The next time he saw tracers at extreme range, he'd remember what that one bullet could do. He'd hesitate. And that hesitation, that half-second of doubt, that was everything. The Luftwaffe tried to adapt. They knew the American gunners were denying the head-on corridor, so they started shifting tactics. Stern attacks, coming from the rear, lower profile, slower closure rate, avoiding the concentrated forward firepower. It worked, briefly, until the waist gunners adapted right back. Now the tail wasn't safe either. They used the same technique. Early fire, long arcs, blanketing the approach corridor, making pilots think twice. It was the same math. Every second a fighter spent closing was a second they were being shot at. Not just by one gunner, but by several, across the formation. The Luftwaffe's safest zones were shrinking, and their margin for error was disappearing. The Germans called it the Massenangriff, the mass attack. 12 fighters diving at once. From different angles. From different altitudes. Fast, loud, chaotic. The idea was simple: overwhelm the bombers. Too many targets. Too many angles. The gunners couldn't shoot everywhere at once. It worked, on paper. But in the air, it took fuel. It took radios. It took timing and coordination and experienced pilots. By late 1944, the Luftwaffe was running short on all of it. They tried other solutions. Armor plating. Steel behind the seat. Thicker canopy glass. Reinforced cowling. It helped, barely. But the extra weight slowed them down. Slower climbs. Slower dives. Slower escapes. That made them easy prey for the P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts that now escorted bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Luftwaffe had run out of tactical tricks. The equation had changed. It used to be simple. Get close fast. Fire at 600 yards. Break off before the gunner can react. Now it was, get close fast. See tracers at 1,400 yards. Decide, keep going, or peel away. And most pilots peeled away. Not because they were cowards. Not even close. The fighter pilots of the Luftwaffe in late 1944 were some of the bravest men still flying. They were outnumbered, outgunned, outmatched. They flew with scarce fuel, under constant radar, against an air force that never stopped growing. They knew the truth. They were losing. They knew the odds. Most wouldn't see the end of the year. But they were also rational. Why press an attack on a bomber that's already throwing tracers in your face at 1,400 yards, when you could circle and try again later? Why take a hit at 1,200 yards, when you might find a softer target in the next wave? But that was the problem. By fall of 1944, there were no soft targets left. Every gunner in every bomber was firing early. By September 1944, Luftwaffe effectiveness against American heavy bombers had dropped to 40% of what it had been just a year before. They still scored kills, but it took longer. They burned more fuel. They made more passes and stayed exposed longer. And that meant they flew into the guns of the Mustangs, the Thunderbolts, and the Lightnings circling above. The math of aerial warfare had shifted. And the pivot point? A 22-year-old kid from Philadelphia in a ball turret over Schweinfurt, who decided one morning to ignore the manual. The irony? The Luftwaffe figured it out. They saw the pattern. In a captured intelligence report dated November 1944, German analysts wrote, "American bomber defensive fire has become more aggressive. Gunners open fire at extreme range, creating psychological pressure on attacking pilots. Recommend head-on attacks be discontinued in favor of high-altitude diving approaches beyond effective defensive range." It was the right advice. The tactical shift that might have helped. But by November 1944, the Luftwaffe was running on fumes. Not enough fuel to climb. Not enough veterans to lead. Not enough time to retrain a shrinking, exhausted fighter force. The war was already lost. And the final tragedy for the German pilots? They couldn't unlearn 4 years of habits. They'd flown hundreds of missions where head-on meant victory, where speed and aggression beat hesitation. They were brave, yes, but bravery couldn't beat tracers at 1,400 yards. The method that Michael Archangelo invented with desperation, refined through instinct, taught with whispers in the barracks, had redrawn the battlefield. By late 1944, it was semi-official doctrine. Not in the manuals. Not in the training films. No colonel stood up at a podium and announced it. But squadron commanders knew. Gunnery sergeants knew. The gunners knew. Shoot early. Shoot long. Shoot high. Deny the corridor. It wasn't about kills. It was about survival. And it worked. They didn't print it in the manuals. But the veterans made sure it got taught. When new gunners arrived from the States, fresh from gunnery school, with polished boots and rulebook precision, the old hands took them aside, away from the officers. Forget what they told you. They said, out here, you shoot early. You shoot high. You make them think twice. It didn't sound heroic. It didn't sound clean. But it worked. The numbers proved it. In 1943, American bomber gunners fired an average of 3,000 rounds for every confirmed fighter kill. By late 1944, that number had dropped to 1,800. Not because gunners had become more accurate. Accuracy was still miserable. But because German fighters stopped pressing in. They saw the tracers at 1,400 yards, at 1,800 yards, and peeled away. They went looking for easier targets. There were none left. The 8th Air Force flew its final heavy bomber mission over Germany on April 25, 1945. By then, the Luftwaffe was gone. Out of fuel, out of aircraft, out of pilots, out of time. Michael Archangelo flew his 25th mission on March 3, 1945. He survived. He was credited with 2 confirmed kills, both traditional shots at under 600 yards. But that wasn't what mattered. He'd driven off dozens of enemy fighters before they ever fired a shot. He'd saved his bomber, again and again. Not with accuracy, but with anticipation. He was never decorated. No medal, no citation, no official commendation for rewriting aerial gunnery doctrine. The brass didn't want to admit that a 22-year-old sergeant in a ball turret had figured out something their instructors, analysts, and generals had missed. Archangelo didn't care. He went home to Philadelphia. He went back to his father's machine shop. He married, had 3 kids, lived quietly, died in 1998 at age 77. His obituary said he'd flown in World War II. It didn't mention that he'd changed air combat forever, but the method lived on. In Korea, B-29 gunners used it against MiG-15 jets, firing early, creating no-fly corridors at 600 miles per hour. The MiG-15 was faster than anything in World War II. It could outrun the B-29, but its pilots still flinched when they saw the tracers. The human brain hadn't changed. In Vietnam, door gunners on Hueys and Chinooks applied the same principle, firing into tree lanes before taking fire. Suppressive fire at long range. Not to hit, but to disrupt. To make the enemy duck, to force hesitation. By the 1980s, the Air Force finally gave the technique a name. Preemptive defensive engagement. They studied it formally, ran simulations, reviewed historical footage, tested it with F-15 and F-16 pilots in mock dogfights. The conclusion was simple. Even inaccurate early fire reduced enemy attack effectiveness by 30 to 40%. Not because it killed, because it altered behavior. And that changed everything. Today, the tactic is taught at the USAF Weapons School, at Top Gun, at every advanced air tactics course in the American military. Modern fighter pilots learn the same thing Archangelo discovered in a freezing ball turret in 1943. Don't wait for the perfect shot. Don't wait until the target fills your sight. Don't wait for confirmation. Engage early. Put rounds into the approach. Put missiles into the sky. Not to hit. To shape. To control. To survive. It's not about accuracy. It's about presence. Posture. Pressure. It's about letting the enemy know, before he even commits. This gunner is awake. This gunner is willing. You want to kill me? You're going to have to fly through fire to do it. You make them react to you, instead of calmly executing their plan. That's the entire principle. And the F-35 understands it. Its onboard targeting system is programmed with this logic. When it detects a threat, even at long range, outside optimal firing parameters, it doesn't wait. It engages. Not to kill, to disrupt, to force the enemy to abort, to adjust, to hesitate. That logic was born in a ball turret in 1943. The same thinking shaped modern close-in defense systems. Take the Navy's Phalanx CIWS, a computer-controlled, radar-guided 20mm Gatling gun. Its job? Stop incoming missiles. Does it aim precisely? No. It sprays a wall of tungsten into the air. A curtain of metal. The goal isn't to hit the missile. The goal is to make the missile fly through hell to get to its target. Sound familiar? Michael Archangelo would have understood the phalanx immediately. You're not shooting at the missile. You're shooting at the space it wants to occupy. That's what he did in his turret. Fill the airspace. Deny the corridor. Let the enemy make the mistake. Some military historians argue that the early fire technique shortened World War II by 3 months. By cutting bomber losses in 1944, it allowed the 8th Air Force to sustain relentless pressure on Germany's industrial backbone. Oil refineries, ball-bearing factories, aircraft production lines. Strategic bombing didn't work because the bombs were accurate. They weren't. It worked because the bombers kept coming. Day after day, mission after mission. And they kept coming because gunners like Archangelo kept them alive. Other gunners claimed they'd figured it out, too. And they probably did. A waste gunner in the 91st Bomb Group named Eddie Kowalczyk swore he'd started firing early in December 43. A nose gunner from the 381st, Ray Martinez, said he'd been doing it since November. They weren't lying. Good ideas often emerge independently when the pressure is high enough. But Archangelo was the first to explain it, the first to understand the physics, to teach it deliberately, to pass it on. Years after the war, a few aviation historians tried to trace its origins. They combed through after-action reports, interviewed surviving gunners. The trail kept leading back to Michael Archangelo. But by then, he was in his 70s, living quietly. He didn't want credit. I just did what made sense. He told an interviewer in 1995, "You see tracers coming at you. You think twice. Doesn't matter if you're German or American. Human nature doesn't change." He was right. Human nature doesn't change. The instinct to avoid pain, to pull away from danger. That reflex is hardwired. And when used correctly, it can shape battles, campaigns, even the outcome of a war. The men who flew in B-17 ball turrets are nearly all gone now. Archangelo, Goodman, Kowalski, Feinstein. They're buried in military cemeteries across the country, or their ashes are scattered in the places they loved. But the idea they gave us, that survived. It's in the doctrine, in the training syllabi, in the software that runs missile systems and targeting AIs. It lives in the instincts of a fighter pilot in 2025, locked in a turning fight over the Pacific or the Middle East, who fires early, puts rounds into empty sky, forces his enemy to hesitate, and survives because of what a 22-year-old machinist from Philadelphia figured out at 27,000 feet over Schweinfurt in 1943.